Welcome to Module 3, Handling Big Data with MapReduce. In this module, we're going to learn how we can process large amounts of data quickly and efficiently using the new MapReduce script type. By the end of this module, you should be able to understand what the MapReduce script type is all about, know when to use a MapReduce script versus a scheduled script, and also identify the advantages of using the MapReduce script type. We're also going to learn how MapReduce does distributed processing. First of all, let's try to talk about what MapReduce is all about. MapReduce is a new script type that was introduced in SweetScript 2.0 so that you can process large amounts of data. In SweetScript 1.0, if you want to process larger datasets, you would have to use the scheduled script. Now, scheduled script is quite effective for larger amounts of data, but there are some disadvantages in using scheduled script. So later we're going to compare scheduled script with a MapReduce script. But the MapReduce script was really designed to handle large amount of data, and that is based on a concept of distributed processing. If you have multiple queues, what you can actually do with MapReduce is that you can split the processing into different queues so that you can process the information all at the same time, which is a very exciting way of using your multiple queues so that you can process data more efficiently. Now, let's take a look at some of the advantages of using the MapReduce script type. There are several exciting advantages of using the MapReduce script. Now, one of those advantages would be distributed processing. And like what I've mentioned, with distributed processing, it allows you to process one script into multiple queues. We're going to cover how that works later. Now, another advantage of using the MapReduce script type is automatic governance handling. Now, imagine having a script type where you can process large amounts of data and you do not have to worry about governance. That's right. You don't need to worry about governance. Even if you need to process large amounts of data, governance would be handled automatically. You don't need to worry about how you can break your script into smaller bits, or if you need to pass information to another script type. Governance will not be an issue with MapReduce, which is very, very exciting for a developer. Now, another advantage of using a MapReduce is that it introduces a custom-based time yielding. What that means is that if your script is processing longer than you expected, what you can do is that you can automatically have it yield so that it's not blocking a certain queue. For example, if the script is running longer than 15 minutes, you can have it automatically yield so that you can have the other scripts in the queue process first and then push your MapReduce script to the back. So that's something that you can do. Other advantages of using a MapReduce script is that you have a summary reporting. So it has a built-in way so that you can easily create a summary of the processes that you have done, and also a built-in way to handle errors. So handling errors is really easy with a MapReduce script. So let's try to see how that works and compare that with a scheduled script. In this illustration, you can immediately see the difference between the MapReduce script and a scheduled script. Now, on the right side, you can see that the scheduled script is just one block of script that is executing from top to bottom. That means that if you are going to run this script, it would have to go through the whole process from top to bottom for it to work. Now, regarding governance handling, this is something that you have to make sure you plan with the scheduled script, because you can't just cut the execution of a scheduled script, or the scheduled script will not work if you cut it the wrong place. Now, with a MapReduce script, the process is a little bit different. So as you can see, instead of running one gigantic script, the MapReduce script is actually composed of smaller stages. Now, there are 4 different stages on a MapReduce script. The first stage is the get input data. With that particular stage, it allows you to get the information that you want to process. The next stage with a MapReduce script is that you map the information. That means that you would process smaller bits of the information that you have in the get input data. And this is the exciting part here. Instead of processing that as part of the main script, it's actually going to run independently. And that would depend on the data that you're processing in the get input data stage. So for example, here you can see in the map that can potentially be multiple results from your search in the get input data. You also have the reduce stage. And with the map stage, what that does is that it allows you to group certain records together. And once those records are grouped, you can process the information in the reduce stage, and then you go to the summary stage. So that's how it works. Now let's talk about the different stages in a little bit more detail. So let's start with the first stage, the get input data stage. And like what I mentioned, this is where you would gather the information that you want to process, or this is where you would prepare your data. Now, the data in the get input stage would depend on how you want to process your information. The data that you can pass in this particular stage would be a saved search. So if you create a saved search and then process that, you can also use an array of objects. You can use a record, or you can also use a reference, which is really exciting. If you already have a saved search, you don't even need to load that saved search. In the get input data stage, you just return a reference to the saved search. This is similar to passing a payload object just in the return statement, so you don't need to even do anything. So that's really exciting and makes handling large amounts of data in the get input data stage really easy. Moving on to the next stage, the map stage, this is where you would group key and value pairs together. What happens is that, for example, if you have a search that you have placed in the get input data stage, the results would be handled individually. So instead of having to loop through the results, the system would automatically just get one piece of result and then process that in one map stage. So as you can see from this illustration, we have multiple map stages running all at the same time. And that would be processing one single element if you have an array, or one search result if you have passed in a search result or a search in your get input data stage. By breaking the process down into multiple sections, this allows the system to pause or yield the execution of your script as necessary. So for example, if you need to stop the execution at a particular time, it would be easy for the system because you are not chopping the execution of one large script. You have smaller processes that are running at the same time. So you can easily just stop certain processes from running and then continue on once the queue is already available. Grouping key value pairs in the map stage is really easy. You don't even need to think about how you're going to group key value pairs. What happens in the map stage is that all you need to do is return a key and value pair, and that would automatically be grouped by the system. You don't even need to think about how you're going to group it again. It's just go ahead and return the key and value pair, and the system would group it for you. So let's try to take a look at how that works. In this illustration, we can see that we have multiple map stages that are running, processing different customers. So for the first execution of the MapReduce script or the map stage, we can see that it is processing ABC marketing, and that is returning the value 450. So the key here in the system is ABC marketing, and then the value, of course, is 450. Now there's another record that has the same key, ABC marketing, and the value of 850. And what will happen there is that the system would see that this key already exists in the system. So instead of replacing that with the other value, it's actually going to combine those two values. So the value for this key value pair would now be 450 and 850. Now moving on to another execution, you see BNB design with the value 180. Since this is not in the system yet, it'll give you the key and value pair of BNB design and then value 180. And then moving on to another record, you have Gentry Inc. with value of 470. And this key value pair would also be recorded in the system. So if there are new entries for the key and value pair, that would be added as a new entry. But if there is an existing key for a certain value, then that value would just be added. So in the result of your key and value pair that would be passed on the next stage, you can have a key and value pair where you have one value or you can have multiple values. So if you want to process that, all you need to do is just loop through the different values in your key and value pair. So that's how it works. On the next stage, we have the reduce stage. Now, the reduce stage would be the final processing stage, and this is where you would finalize the processing of your data. Now, at this stage, you already have a key and value pair. So all you need to do is just get the key and then process the values for that particular key. Now, one thing that we have to remember with the MapReduce stage is that the map stage and the reduce stage are actually optional. They're optional in a way that if you have already provided the map stage or if you have processed something on the map stage, you don't need to process anything in the reduce stage. Or if you process something in the reduce stage, you don't necessarily need to process the map stage. Now again, the difference with the map and the reduce stage is that in the map stage, you have the ability to group key and value pairs. If you don't need to group your data, you can just go ahead and use the map stage without using the reduce stage. But if you have to group your data, for example, if you want to process multiple invoices per customer, you want to group those invoices per customer, then you would have to use the map stage so that you can group key and value pairs and then process those key and value pairs in the reduce stage. So that's what the reduce stage is all about. It's just further processing the data that you've grouped in the map stage. The last stage in the process is the summarize stage, and this is where you would summarize the information or generate a report if that's something that you need to do. Now, this stage is completely optional. You can omit this if you don't need to process anything. Now, error handling is also done in the summarize stage, so I would recommend that you put in information, at least for error handling, on the summarize stage. But if you don't need to generate a report or do anything like that, then the summarize stage, again, can be completely omitted. MapReduce is all about distributed processing, so let's try to take a look at how distributed processing works in the new MapReduce script type. First, let's try to compare distributed processing from a scheduled script perspective. So let's say we have 3 queues, so we only have these 3 queues available, and then we have a scheduled script. What you would do in a scheduled script is that you would create a deployment record and then assign that deployment record to a particular queue. Now, as you can see here, the scheduled script was assigned to the first queue. Unfortunately, there are other scheduled scripts that are lined up before our scheduled script. So that means that we have to wait for the scheduled scripts that are lined up first before our scheduled script would execute. But if we look at Q2, the second queue doesn't really have anything, and it would have benefited the execution of our script if we actually moved the execution of the queue to the second queue because that is empty. But the thing is, with a scheduled script, you only have one option, and that is where you actually deploy that scheduled script, which in this case is Q1. Now let's try to compare what happens with a MapReduce script. Comparing that with the MapReduce script, we can see here that we have the get input data stage. And again, with the MapReduce script, you don't process the whole script, but you process one stage at a time. Now, in this case, we are processing the get input data stage. And the amazing thing with the MapReduce script is that you can select the queues that you want to use. You don't just select one. For example, if you have 15 queues and you want to use all those 15 queues, then you can select those 15 queues for processing. That means that all of the queues are available for you. Now, here in this illustration, we can see that the get input data stage was passed into Q1, Q2, and then Q3. So what happens here is that pointers are placed in each of those queues. So these are not the execution, but these are actually just pointers. So pointer in Q1, another pointer in Q2, and then another pointer in Q3. Since those are just pointers, what will happen is that the system would look at which queue is currently available. So since Q1 and Q3 are not available because of the scheduled scripts that are scheduled before our get input data stage, and Q2 is available, it'll cancel all the other pointers and then execute the script where it can execute. And again, this is very exciting. is just having multiple queues available to you and automatically balancing the load for you without you having to think about anything. And this is a feature that a lot of people have been requesting for with the schedule script, but is now being introduced with the MapReduce script type. And it's not just for the get input data stage. This is also available with other stages. Same thing is happening here in our map stage. So remember, the map stage is processing one single piece of information at a time. So that means here we are processing two information. Maybe we have an array processing two pieces of information. So that's why we have two map stages. Now again, pointers are given or thrown into the queue and it would be processed where it would be processed, which in this case is still Q2. And moving on here, we can see that Q3 finally opened up so that the second map execution is actually running on Q3, and then the pointer on Q1 for map 2 has already been canceled. So as you can see, this is a very exciting way to process large amounts of data, and if you have multiple queues available to you, you can process larger amounts of data without having to worry about a script blocking your queue, because again, it's not pushing one whole script into a queue, but instead it's breaking that down into smaller bits. So governance is not an issue, and you can process your script so much faster because you have multiple queues available to you. So let's go ahead and go to a walkthrough, and in this walkthrough, what we're going to do is that we're going to total all of the invoices for each customer. So we're going to group all of the invoices per customer, total that, and then maybe just log that information in the execution log. We can also use that to process a report, let's say, but just to make it simple, we're just going to use a log. Now we're going to look at all of the invoices in our account and try to guess how long it would take to process all those information. So anyway, what we want to learn here is that we want to see the MapReduce in action so that we can use that in our scripts. So let's go ahead and go to the walkthrough. Let's go ahead and build our script. So let me go to File, New, Suite Script File. So for the script that we are building, of course, that will be a MapReduce script. And then for the file name, let's just say, let's call this SDR_MR_invoice_totals. Okay, there you go. And then for our module, we only need one module for this particular script, and that'll be the search module, because we will be creating a search. I'm also going to show you how you can use object references in case there's already a saved search that you want to use for your particular script. So let me click on OK, click on Finish, and that is it. I have my script again. Let me just reformat this a little bit. Just a personal preference here again. There you go. Okay. So first off, we want to go to our get input data. So again, get input data is where you will be preparing the data that you will be processing in the script. So you can either use a save search, an array if you have an array, or if you have some records that you want to use, or you can actually use an object reference. Now, what is an object reference? If you already have a saved search and you want to access that saved search, you don't need to load that in your MapReduce script. What you need to do is that you just need to return a value. For example, if I want to create a transaction search, or if I already have a transaction search, I can just say, okay, transaction, and then the ID of that transaction, that would be, let's say, 123, and that's it. That's already the data that you will be using for your MapReduce script. And again, as you can see here, it is just really an amazing way for you to process large amounts of data, and the work for the developer is just very small because you don't have to worry about configuring anything. Here, if I already had a saved search, I could, already use this. So yeah, that's something that you might want to play around with. So anyway, since we don't have a saved search, let's go ahead and build our search. So for our search, I'll just call this my invoice search. or maybe INV search, that'll be fine. So invoice search, so that's search dot create, and then let's put our payload information. So the type, of course, would be a transaction search. And then for my filters, change that, filters. So for this one, I'll also just use a search expression to make it easy for us to build our search. Okay, there you go. Let me just format that in a bit. Format that a little bit. And here we are looking for the type. Okay, so type any of. And then for this one, we are going to look for customer invoices. So again, if you don't know the values that you need to put in as a type, please look for the type values in the Help Center. So that would be listed there. So aside from the type, I also want to make sure that I only will be returning one line instead of all of the different lines on my invoice. So I'm going to add main line, then my operator would be is, and then my value would be true. That's it. Okay? So there you go. What I'm going to do for this search is that I'm going to search for all customer invoices so that we can process all the information in our account. Okay, I'm not going to filter this by customer. It kind of doesn't make sense if I filter this by customer, because that would just shrink down my data. What I want is that my data set to be huge so that we can see how fast it would perform even if I have lots of data. Okay? So anyway, so that's my filter, and then for my columns, so let me add my columns here. I just want to return the name of my customer, which is the entity field, and also the total, because that's what we need to add up. Okay? So far, nothing really different here. We're just creating a search, and that's all I need to do in the get input data stage. If I want to pass this to the next stage, return that search information. So invoice search. Okay? As you can see here, I don't need to parse the results of the get input data or my search. All I need to do is just pass the actual search. The system would get that search, interpret that information, and already process that in the background. You don't need to, add additional processing in your script. I mean, that is just really cool because that saves us a lot of work. Okay? Now, moving on to our next stage, if I go to the map stage here, remember the map stage is where our initial processing would happen. What will happen in the map stage is that it will get information regarding one particular data set of your result. Okay? So here on your result, it would give you your one element of your search. So instead of looping through the results of the search, you only need to worry about that one data set that would be returned. Okay? You don't need to iterate through the result. Since we will be getting just one result, we will be processing that, splitting the information. Remember, we are returning two pieces of information here, the entity name or the name of the customer and also the total. So what we're going to do is just return the name and the entity as the key and then the total as the value. And if you remember from our discussion, what's going to happen is that if that entity or that particular key is already present in the system, it would add to the total, not add as in have it summed up, but it would add that to the list. So you would have multiple total values in your value chain. Okay? So there you go. Let's go to our map. And by the way, the information that would be returned in the context object would be under the value property. And that value property would be returned as a JSON string. So make sure that you parse that first before you try to process the information. So let me get that search result. Again, just one single value here, not the whole search results object. Okay. So, and again, since this is a JSON object, I'm going to just parse that. So JSON.parse. And from my context, if I want to get the key and the value, I need to get that from the value property. Okay. So value here does not refer to the key and value pair, but the value would refer to the result from our search, that one element or one search result from the list of search results that we've returned from our get input data stage. Okay. So now that we have gotten that one result from our search result, all we need to do is just write that back to the context so that we can pass that to our reduce stage. Also, I want to remind you that the map stage is optional if you already have the reduce stage, and the reduce stage is optional if you already have the map stage, but you can use both if you need to. Now, in this case, we need both because we need to group all of the transactions together before we can add them up. Okay, so here we go. So with the result, again, all I need to do is just write that into the context.write. And for this, I just need to add my key value pairs. So I have my key. So for the key, that would be returned under the values property. So search, so the JSON string, and what I'm going to do here is that, yeah, maybe I'll log that information so that you can see it. It's going to kind of muddy our search logs a little bit, but I just want to show you the result or the resulting value that's coming in from my context object. So log.debug, and then I'll just log my search result, or I'll just log the raw value, context.value. Okay, so that we can see that come in. Okay, so there you go. Or maybe just add in a title so that we can differentiate this from the other logs that we will be generating. So this would be my raw map data. Yeah, that's a good name. There you go. Okay. So anyway, so again, what's going to happen is that you have that search result. So from that search result, you have a values property. Then under that values property, that is where you would get your entity and your total. So that's kind of what the structure is. But we are going to see that structure later once we run our script, because we're going to look at this particular log. Okay, so this is kind of unnecessary, but I'm just showing you this so that you can see the structure of the JSON string. Okay, there you go. So search result, and like what I mentioned, you will get that from the values property, and that's where you would get all of the column information. So for the key, I'm going to use the entity value. But if I use entity, this would be referring to the internal ID of the customer. Okay? So entity would refer to the internal ID. If you want to get the name of the customer, and in this case, I can use either the internal ID or the name as a key. It doesn't really matter. Now, if there is a case where maybe you are building a key and value pair array, and you think that the key that you will be using can potentially have some conflicts, like for a customer, you can have the same name for multiple customers. So let's say that's going to happen. If that's the case, don't use the name of the customer as your key, just use the internal ID. Okay? Now, in this case, we know that the customer name can never be duplicated. You can't have a customer with the exact same name. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to use the name of the customer as our key. So instead of the internal ID, I can add .text so that we can get the name of the customer instead as our key. Okay? So again, you have your entity here. If this is a drop-down or a list or record field, then you will get the ID in the entity field, or if you want to get the text or the name of the customer, then just add in .text there. Now for the value, this should be pretty simple because this is just a number. Okay, so for this one, so that's search result dot values dot total. That's it. Nothing to fuzz about here because that's just one number value. Okay, and that's about it for the map stage. So as you can see, no additional processing, no need to loop through and then figure out, because in this case, if you're going to do this in a scheduled script, you have to figure out, okay, how do I group all of the values together? I would have to add in, say, a for loop or a while loop, and then I would have to have another for loop or while loop inside that so that I can group things together, and that can potentially be complicated. And not just complicated, that can slow things down because you have a for loop and then you have another loop inside your for loop, and that would definitely slow all your processing down. But in this case, we're not doing that because the system is mapping all of the values on its own without having to add in a loop within a loop. So that's what we are kind of avoiding here. Okay. So anyway, again, in the map stage, what we did was that we took our result and then wrote that result back into the context as a key and value pair. Now going down here to our reduce stage, so this is where we are going to process the information. And the only thing that we need here would be just sum all the information up. That's it. So just add all of the invoice totals. Remember that with the key and value pair that we have returned on the map section, there is a potential, and most likely the value pair would be an array of totals because you can have multiple invoices for a customer. Okay, so that means that we have to loop through our values and then add them up. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so first off, let's create a total variable. Let's set that to 0 so that we can use that as a counter for all our totals. So let's add a for loop here, and I'm going to use kind of a for each format here. So I in context.values. Similar to your map stage, you can get the information from your reduce stage from the values property of your context. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're just looping the information on the value. Remember, on the reduce stage, this would also process one key value pair. Okay, it's not going to give you all of the key values or the key value chain. It's just going to give you one. So you only need to worry about one information. And that's a really neat thing here. It's going to split all of the processing into, say, if you're going to use multiple queues, it's going to split that into the different queues. It's not going to just process one chunk. That makes it really, really efficient. So anyway, for the total, again, nothing fancy here. All we need to do is just, total everything. So here, total. And then we have our, and here, just to make sure, we're going to use the parse float. And we have our context value and then values. This is going to be an array. So I'll add in our counter here inside. That's it. Again, nothing fancy here. All I'm doing is that I am adding all of the values inside our array. That's it. That's the only thing that I'm doing. And I'm going to log that information to our execution log. So again, log.debug. And then here I have the key value pair. So I'll have the context as a key, and that's going to be my title. And then for the total, just the total value that we have added up. That's it. And as you can see, if you try to look at the code, for processing the search information or our data set, we just use this. It's really, really short. And for grouping things together, just this. In fact, this is just practically 2 lines. I've just added this extra line so that we can see the raw map information. And then for adding things up, just this. If you think about doing this in a scheduled script, and really, if you really think about it, this is not going to take that, it would take far too many lines to process this, and that would really, tend to be complicated if you do this in a scheduled script. So, but by using a MapReduce script, there are a lot of things that are automatically done by the system already. So those things are, things that you don't really need to worry about. It really makes the development for processing larger amount of data so much simpler. So anyway, going down here to the summarize section, again, this is just a way for you to report on the performance or whatever happened to the execution of your script. So here what I'm going to do is that I'm going to get the process. So I have a summary property here, which is kind of the same as the context, except that this would contain the information about, well, the summary of the execution. So this would depend on where the execution stopped. So maybe you've encountered an error and it stopped at the map stage, so you can, report on information about the map stage and so on. So in this case, I would assume that everything is working properly. Otherwise, I would add some error handling code here. So that's something that I can also do. So for the summary, I'll just say summary dot to string so that we can get the name of the summary here. And then I'll just add in some debug lines so that we can see what happened, or maybe just use audit. I think that would be a perfect debug type or log type for this one. So here I'll just say audit type, and then let's get a few information. You wouldn't always use this, but this is just a good example of the things that you can use. For example, if you want to know how much units were consumed, okay, so here usage consumed by your MapReduce script. So I have that from my summary, so summary.usage. So that's one property that you can get. And maybe I'll just duplicate this. I have 3 other properties that I want to show you, which is the number of queues, maybe. Okay, so in case you want to report on that, so you would know how many queues were used by this particular script. So concurrency, there you go. That's another value that we need. And we also want to know maybe how many times our MapReduce yielded. In case there are a lot of scripts that are lined up in our queues, did it yield automatically? I want to know what happened there. So here, number of yields. Okay. So summary.yield. So these are just, a few information that we can use in our script. Okay. Okay, continuing on here, let me just upload my script so that we can create our script record. So let me go ahead and upload this script, and let's go to our NetSuite account. So here in our NetSuite account, if I go to customization, scripting, scripts new, okay, and let's go ahead and build our script, okay. So if I choose our MapReduce script here, click on create script record. So that's going to build our MapReduce script, and I'll just call this Sweet Dreams MR invoice totals. Okay, totals. There you go. And then for our ID, pretty much the same, underscore str underscore mr underscore invoice underscore totals. There we go. And then for the deployment, so instead of adding information in our deployment or a quick deployment subtab, I will just hover over save and then click on save and deploy so that we can see all of the options that we have here. So let me click on save and deploy. For the ID, again, I'll just use the same ID, underscore str underscore mr underscore invoice totals. So you can see here the options are kind of the same as our scheduled script, where you have your schedule if you want this to happen like a single event, a daily event, a weekly event, a monthly event, and so on. The thing that is different though would be this section. So in this section, it asks me, okay, what queues do I want to use for this particular deployment. Now, in a scheduled script, you can only choose one. Like, okay, I'm going to put that in Q2, and that's it. I don't really have any choice but just put that in Q2. But in a MapReduce script, you can choose up to all of the scripts. Now in this, or all of the queues. Now in this case, I have a SuiteCloud Plus upgrade level 3, so that's why I have 15 queues. But let's say you only have 5 queues. So just select all 5 queues. Or make it simple, just put a check mark on select all if you want to use those queues. Now you don't always want to select all of the queues because you might be using some of the queues for dedicated high priority processing. Let's say Q1 is only dedicated for a certain report that you want to generate quickly. Then of course you don't want to select that. You want to select the other queues. Okay? But the system would automatically look for all of the open queues that you've selected. Say if you've selected 1 to 5, and if 4 is open, it's just going to use that particular queue. So you don't have to worry about load balancing because the system already does that for you. Another thing that is different with a script deployment for a MapReduce is this yield after a certain set of minutes. For example, if your script is running for a very, very long time and you want it to not block a certain queue, you can have it to automatically yield after executing for a few minutes. Let's say if it's running for more than an hour, then you can have it yield after about an hour. So that's something that you can do. Okay, so very, very useful tools here. So anyway, let me save this. Okay, there you go. Before we execute our MapReduce script, one thing that I want to show you is that let's try to take a look at all of the invoices in our account. So let me open this in a new subtab. And as you can see here, let me just wait for this to load a little bit. Right now we have about just almost 9,000 records. Almost, just about. Okay? Now think about this if we are going to process this in a scheduled script. Okay? So if we are going to process about 9,000 records in a scheduled script, how long would it take if we need to loop through the search result, group the invoices per customer? So that means that while we're looping through the result, we're going to match invoices to a customer. And then after that, loop through all of the values so that we can add that and then log that to the system. And we're not really processing anything else, just log that to the system. 9,000 records, how long would it take for a scheduled script? Now keep that number in mind, just try to guess, and let's see how your guesses match with a MapReduce script. Okay, again, remember 9,000 records. So if you have processed quite a bit of information on a scheduled script, you would know how long it would take to sometimes just wait for a scheduled script to execute. But let's just look at processing here. So anyway, I'm going to edit this and I'm going to hover over my script deployment and I'm going to click on Save and Execute. Okay, so let me click on Save and Execute, click on OK. And let's just wait for that to load. Okay, so it's already processing. You can get the information here by going to customization scripting, and we have a MapReduce script status. And by the way, previously, if you hover over script deployments, let me go back here, you have a status fly out on script deployment. Now it has a separate entry on the menu. You can even get more information about the totals by clicking on that. Let me go back here. Oh, by the way, the processing is already complete. I'm not even done explaining it. And that took us less than a minute to complete everything. Okay, and that's how fast MapReduce is. But anyway, going back to my explanation, if I click on details, it'll give you the execution of all of the different stages of MapReduce. So as you can see, get input data, you don't need to break that down into smaller queues. It's just going to look for which queue is available. And in this case, it shows Q10. map was split into different queues because remember, you will be processing the information one at a time. So that has to be split into multiple queues. You also have shuffle that groups everything together. And then you have the reduce stage where we are actually counting the number of totals, and then we have summarize. And again, just imagine how fast that execution was. If I go to my deployment, if I go to my execution logs, you can see here, okay, so we have that. Oh, did we log the information? Now let me run our scheduled script or our MapReduce script here. So I'll just hover over save and then click on save and execute. And let's see what happens. Okay, so right now the MapReduce script is processing. So as you can see, it's already in the get input data stage. If you want to look at the MapReduce script status page, what you need to do is just go to customization, go to scripting, and then click on MapReduce status. Also notice here that we have a scheduled script status. So this is actually getting its own menu. Previously, if you wanted to go to the scheduled script status, what you needed to do was that you needed to go to script deployment, and if you hover over script deployment, there is a status flyout that comes up when you go to script deployment, but now it is on a separate page. One other thing that I want to point out with a MapReduce stage is that there is a link here that gives you the details of the execution. So let me click on that. And if we look at the details, as you can see, okay, the processing of our data set is already complete, and it's already going for our map stage. So as you can see, it's already processing that. Let me just refresh this. Let's see if that would... Okay, so it's still processing. But let me go to my deployment, and we should see some logs generated already because of the raw map data that we have logged. So as you can see, it already processed 5,000 information, and we haven't really spent that much time. We just spent maybe 1 or 2 minutes on this. Anyway, just quickly here, I'm going to get the raw JSON format for my map, and let's try to format this so that we can view the information better. So as you can see, this is the object that is returned in the map stage. You have your record type, and this is invoice because we are searching for invoice information. We also have the ID of this particular invoice, and if I expand this, since we are returning 2 fields, we have the entity field and we have the total field. So again, that would be inside the values property. And like what I mentioned earlier, if I expand this, I have 2 information, either the internal ID of the customer and the name of the customer. In our case, we are using the name as the key for our key value pair. And yeah, I do have to apologize because I mentioned earlier that the internal ID is inside the entity field. But yeah, so it looks like I was mistaken there. The value information is actually, or the internal ID information is actually inside its own separate property called the value. Okay, so this is the structure. If you're not familiar with the structure, like if you are processing the map stage for the first time and you're not really sure of the structure, you can just log the information and you can go to this website. So this is not affiliated to NetSuite in any way, but this is what I personally use, so that I can format JSON string so it would be readable. Okay. Now, anyway, going back to our script here, let me just refresh and let's see what happens. Okay, so it looks like it's already complete. Okay. So just imagine that what we did was that we logged information from our map stage, we totaled, or we summed up all of the total information for our invoice, and that would be for just about 9,000 records, and we were able to complete that in under 5 minutes. Just imagine how fast that is. Just almost 9,000 records under 5 minutes. And this is just really exciting for developers because one, it would process information so much faster. And two, you don't need to worry about governance. We didn't really add in any code regarding governance in our script. We didn't think about how much units we will be using. Everything would be handled for us by the system. If there's anything that is outside of the governance, it would automatically reschedule. And since you have all of the queues, or even if you don't have all of the queues, what if you only had like 5 queues? You can still use all of those 5 queues and have the system balance the load so that your script would execute faster. So again, the MapReduce script is just a very exciting functionality that is available in SweetScript 2.0. And this is, for me personally, this is enough for me to upgrade all of my scheduled scripts so that I would use a MapReduce script instead. Again, very exciting feature, and I hope you enjoy that. Okay, so that's about it for this walkthrough, and let's go ahead and go to our discussion. A few things that you have to remember. The get input data stage is where you prepare your data. You are going to either process a search, an array, or a reference to a saved search. After gathering all your data, you're going to pass that to the map stage where you can process the data into key and value pairs or just process the data in general. Remember that if you already have a map stage, you don't necessarily need to use the reduce stage unless you want to group your information or process your information into key value pairs. Moving on, after the map stage, you have your reduce stage, and this is where you would finalize your map data. Since you already have key and value pairs, process those key and value pairs. And again, this is optional if you already have the map reduce stage. But if you don't have the map reduce or the map stage, you have to make sure that you have a reduce stage. You have to either have one of each. So either a map stage or a reduce stage, or you can have both. Then lastly, on the stage, we have our summarize stage. And this is the place where you would be handling reports, or if you want to add in audit trails or statistics. And this is also where you would process errors. So this stage is optional. You can opt to not use the summarize stage, or you can just use that for error handling. And a quick comparison here between the MapReduce and the schedule script. If you want to process larger amounts of data, you can use the MapReduce script. And if you have a smaller data set where you don't really need to worry about governance, or if you don't need to yield your script after a particular execution, again, based on governance, then you can just use a scheduled script. But if your data set is larger and you think that you will be running against issues on governance, then I do recommend that you use the MapReduce script type instead. Now it's your turn. Please complete the following activity. That's about it for this module. Please go ahead and continue on to the next module.